At age 12, I started babysitting for family friends who had three daughters ages 4 to 7. They lived in a cul-de-sac where nearly every home housed a young couple with children in elementary school. The neighborhood was extremely close-knit. Like the 1950s American block party communities, they had a communal policy on using one another's toys. Any kid could use a play structure in someone else's yard at any time without asking. Shortly after I started working in the neighborhood, they revised the rule to any time a family is not using a babysitter to watch their kids to ensure that I would not get overwhelmed supervising a swarm of kids. I wasn't paid to watch. It was thus more or less known when parents were going out and leaving someone else in charge of their children. I was welcome to take the girls to play in any other yard as they wanted. Their parents even gave me permission to let them play in someone else's yard or sandbox independently. If I needed a short break, being an avid Babysitter's Club reader, I didn't leave the girls outside unsupervised ever. I would wait until someone else wanted a water or bathroom break and then crawl everyone inside temporarily. Similarly, when the girls wanted to play in the treehouse owned by an older couple, a few doors down the street, I climbed up despite a slight fear of heights and crouched in the little house with them, despite feelings of claustrophobia to follow my own rule. I don't recall whether my everyone inside everyone outside together rule preceded the first odd interaction I had with the immediate next door neighbor or not. But when the police questioned the girls I babysat years later, they said nothing bad ever happened when I watched them, because I set up that weird, sometimes annoying rule. One day, while playing basketball with the girls in the driveway, the next door neighbor came outside in a baseball cap and sunglasses and sat down on his second story deck to read a paperback. I later noticed he turned his chair around 180 degrees to face us and the basketball hoop. I couldn't tell if he was looking at us. He had no reaction to me, staring at him flipping pages in the book like someone would when reading. This behavior repeated. Every time we played basketball for the 5 years, I watched the girls. Eventually, once I noticed him in the chair accessories on, I would suggest a game that we could play inside or in the front yard. But out of view, the strange neighbor was familiar to me as he went to my church. I've never seen someone knee in a pew, head bowed and hands folded, with the same level of intensity before or since once when my family was seated behind him. The priest came over to ask me to lead the children's mass during the homily, because the usual person was out sick. This guy turned around and glared at me, like I was personally set out to interrupt his prayer time. When I worked in the church nursery during various masses, I would often make eye contact with him as he waited in line outside the nursery door to use the restroom. From what I gleaned from our family, friends, and other people in the neighborhood, the odd basketball observer was a nice guy who gave up his apartment and job in the city to move in with and care for his sick elderly mother. Since everyone thought that he was great, and since he went to church, this was before the Catholic sex scandal broke. I figured I was in the wrong for finding him creepy. Even as young as 12, I was used to guys in their 40s and 50s asking me to go somewhere with them, or driving by slowly as I walked, biked, jogged to make lewd comments. I figured I was projecting those experiences onto this awkward, quiet guy who was not doing anything wrong. For instance, I was certain that if the guy next door was a creep, he would not miss an opportunity to watch with his sunglasses on and book in hand while the kids. And I went swimming each summer when the family opened their above-ground pool, but he never set foot out on his deck when the kids and I donned swimsuits to play in the pool or backyard. I was more convinced that I was conceited and mean. Then when I was 15 or 16, I caught him looking in the window. As I cleaned up after a movie night, the girls and I put on a film after bath time. And instead of watching it theater style in total darkness, we kept some lights on so I could braid the girls' hair. The big screen TV we used for movies was located in an addition on the house with floor to ceiling windows. Though my parents were OCD about shutting blinds and curtains. When the sun went down to prevent people from seeing in our family, friends had no window treatments on the big modern windows. When I turned off the last light in the room, a floor lamp right next to a window facing the neighbor's house, I could see into the darkness outside where the weird man sat on his deck in a chair in line with the window. I was looking through. I looked over my shoulder and realized that he had a line of sight on where the girls and I sat on the floor during the movie. As I looked back towards the house, I glimpsed him hustling inside. I would have doubted I'd seen him at all if he had not left the chair in an unusual spot after watching him turn the chair around to read during many a basketball match. I knew where the chair was sat that night facing the window into the family room was not the chair's usual position on the deck. After that incident, I would suggest playing board games in another room or insist on watching the movies theater style to ensure that he could not peep on what we did at night. Once the girls were asleep, I avoided the family room entirely because I was paranoid about being watched. If I wasn't in the kitchen, doing homework or reading away from all the windows, I'd walk around the original first floor footprint of the house, where all the windows had curtains. The first time the parents noticed my change in routine, they insisted that I could watch TV or movies in the family room. I didn't mention anything to them because I was worried. My concerns were silly and conceited. When I was 17, my family heard an evening cable news story about a man in our town caught in a police sting operation in which a woman pretended to prostitute her 2-year-old. When they raided the house, the police found a ton of CP on his computer. Our family friends called a couple of weeks later. They wanted to know how I knew that the young man next door to them was not safe. He was the guy that I had heard about on TV, as they described it. The police found his blog, where he wrote about his obsession with one of the girls who lived next door to him. It detailed his fantasies involving her and the plans to act on them. Things like lying in the treehouse for hours, hoping to corner her. When she climbed up alone to play, many of his entries focused on taking advantage of or kidnapping the girl, while the babysitter was in charge in his head. Babysitters were like the ones in old movies, talking to friends on the phone or making it with a boy, and they invited over instead of caring for the children. As it became clear, I did neither of those things. His plans evolved to killing the babysitter, taking the girl, and then getting out of Dodge. After talking to the girls to ensure that they were not victims, the police suggested that I might know something to have acted the way I did. All the pieces, the frequent run-ins at the church, when I had children in me, or the weird things he did when he knew that I was watching the kids next door, all fit together, cohesively. I was relieved and not mean-spirited or imagining things. I was perhaps conceited. The focus was not on me, but on the children, but I was not crazy. I recognized that I was not the person most at risk in this situation. And yet suburb, pedo, and would-be murder. Let's not meet again. When I was a 16 to 17-year-old girl, I would babysit for a set of twins 8-year-olds that lived across the street from me. It was the ideal summer job. I ferried them to and from various activities, and in between, we spent every second outside. Every day was a new adventure. Adding to the fun, the twins' family owned a medium-sized sweet as pie poodle mix, who loved people more than anything. This dog was incredibly smart, gentle, and loving. She wouldn't have harmed a fly. We could count on her to go on adventures with us. She would follow us at a far pace, exploring on her own, but always keeping us within earshot. Whenever we met new people, she'd be gleefully bound towards them, eager to lick them and get pets, and express just how happy she was to see them. She was the best. I remember one late summer morning, we decided to spend a few hours drawing on the front driveway in chalk. The kids drew and rolled up and down the street on their scooters, while I lay on the driveway with a dog soaking up the heat. Not many adults were around. It was a weekday, and most were at work, but I couldn't have felt safer in the midday sun in the safety of our suburb. Occasionally, a neighbor would walk down in the street, and the dog would settle up to them in greeting. While I spent a few minutes making small talk, this continued for a while, and I was getting really relaxed by the heat and the sound of the kids playing and laughing. The dog was resting beside me, dozing, when suddenly I heard a low growl coming from her. It was a noise I'd never heard her make before, and it took me by surprise. I sat up and looked around immediately, and there, coming down the sidewalk towards me and the kids, was a man I'd never seen before. He was older and a bit haggard looking, and he was watching us like a hawk. The dog was having none of him, and her growls slowly got louder and more intense as he meandered towards us. This should have been a sign to me, but I didn't know anything. I was 17 and too young to understand, to trust my gut. All I knew was to be polite. He stopped with laser focus on me and started trying to have a conversation with me. This was normal. Other people had walked by and done the same throughout the morning, but he was asking weirder questions, questions about our plans for the day, what I was doing with the kids, where their parents were, etc. It was unnerving, but he was an adult. So, I tried to answer in as polite but vague a way as possible. He kept trying to get closer to me. The children were mercifully racing away on their scooters for most of this experience, and his gaze turned into something more like a leer any time to move near, though. The dog would growl louder, and she started barking viciously. I had never seen her act like this, and it actually got to the point where I was holding her back and trying to calm her down, all while apologizing for her behavior. He faltered in the presence of her. Even though she wasn't big, she was standing her ground and protecting me. Even though the threat had materialized in my mind, just as quickly as he had been coming closer, he backed off, said a quick goodbye, and hurried away down the street. I never saw him again. And in the many years I babysat for that family, I never saw their dog behave that way either. I have always wondered if she sensed some threat from him that I wasn't able to pick up on that day. I truly think that she protected me and the kids from something awful. It could have been nothing. And y'all reading this might think it's silly to even write about, but I have never forgotten that encounter. When I turned 11, I started babysitting my nieces and nephews because I was finally old enough. I had been babysitting for about 4 years when this happened. I was about 15 at the time, and my sister worked early mornings. So, she had me stay the night to babysit for her. I wasn't allowed to have a phone, so my mom would let me take hers just in case I babysat 2 boys. One was about 8 at the time, I'll call him D, and the other was 3 or 4. I'll call him N. My sister lived in a not-so-great part of town, so I would always keep the doors locked up tight. Plus, I liked to listen to scary stories. I was super into true crime, so I was a pretty paranoid kid. There was a pretty large apartment complex next to my sister's house, and I had some pretty sketchy people there, but they had a pretty nice playground and a basketball court right outside the house. And we went to play there a lot on this particular day though. I had just woken up and I was making French toast for my two nephews. I was listening to music with my earbuds because they were still sleeping. But I knew that they'd be up soon. You know, when you have music in your ears, how sometimes it sounds like someone is calling out to you, or you think that you hear something. Well, I keep hearing noises, and I keep pulling my earbuds out to listen, but the noises would stop. I did that about a dozen times, before eventually chalking it up to my imagination. About the time I was finishing up the French toast, my nephews came out of the room and into the kitchen, ready to eat. I sat my younger nephew in his booster chair and started cutting pieces up for him to eat, while my older nephew was sitting at the table with a plate full of French toast. We turned on the XM radio and started playing some kids' music while eating. I thought I was hearing noises again, but I kind of tuned them out. We finally finished eating, and I put the dishes in the sink and got the kids dressed. They were begging to go to the playground. So, I gave in and said, sure. As I was getting dressed, I heard a loud crack. I jumped and ran out of the room, pretty freaked out. And I went to check on the boys. Dee came out of the room with them in his arms. I looked at Dee and said, did you break something? He shook his head and looked absolutely petrified. I told the boys to stay in the hallway since there were no windows. And I wasn't really sure what was going on. I started to walk around the house to see if something had fallen, but nothing looked out of place. I saw a shadow peeking in through the front door. The door had an oval glass pane, but it was difficult to see in unless you had your hands cupping your face while pressed against the window. I couldn't see his face, but he was in all black and he had black gloves on. I was standing to the side, so he couldn't see me. He looked around for a minute or two until he ran around the house again. I quietly ran back to the hallway and shoved my nephews into the bathroom and whispered, lock the door behind you. He was panicked and confused, but I didn't have a phone with me. I had to go back to the kitchen and get it. He closed and locked the door, and I ran back out to grab my mom's phone. I heard glass cracking again, and I started to lose my shit. I started crying and shaking, and I called my sister. I don't really know why, but I called her and told her that someone was trying to break into the house. She freaked out and told me that I needed to call the cops. I told her I was scared, and I didn't want to hang up. I finally did, and called the police. I was still in the kitchen and saw another man running across the backyard. I was sobbing and shaking, and the police weren't being quick enough. After asking my address and the necessary questions, they told me to stay on the line and they were sending someone out. It felt like it took forever, but finally, a cop car drove around the neighborhood and said that we were fine. I told them that there were two men outside trying to get in, so they got out of their cars and looked around the house. They went to the side that I heard the giant crack, and they saw one of the windows was shattered as another was cracked. They were definitely trying to get in, but I don't know what they were planning on doing. There was a giant bed frame in front of two broken windows. I think if it wasn't there, I'd probably not be telling this story. They never caught the men that were trying to get in, but I hope that I'm never in a situation like that again.